Rachel and Jackson had been married for over a decade, and their life together seemed harmonious. They chose not to have children, a decision that allowed them to focus on their careers and community service. Rachel, in particular, was passionate about her volunteer work. She organized charity events, helped local schools, and was always the first to offer assistance when someone in the community needed help. Her dedication earned her respect and admiration in Woodlake. Jackson's career had been on an upward trajectory for years. His recent promotion came with increased responsibilities, leading to longer hours at the office and frequent business trips. Rachel, though initially proud of her husband's achievements, began to notice that Jackson was spending more time away from home. He often returned late, citing work as the reason, and while Rachel trusted him, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Despite Jackson's absences, Rachel tried to maintain the balance in their marriage. She focused on her community activities, hoping that the busyness would distract her from the loneliness she was beginning to feel. Jackson's behavior, however, started to change. He became more distant, less engaged in their conversations, and seemed to be preoccupied even when he was home. The closeness they once shared started to erode, replaced by a subtle but growing tension. Rachel's best friend Jennifer and her husband Kevin were a constant presence in the Millers' lives. Jennifer and Rachel had been friends for years, and their bond was strong. The two couples often spent time together, sharing meals and participating in community events. Jackson and Kevin had also developed a friendship, which seemed natural given their shared interests and the close relationship between their wives. Over time, Rachel began to notice that Jackson and Kevin were spending more time together. At first, she thought nothing of it. Kevin was, after all, a friend, and it made sense that they would occasionally meet up. However, the frequency of their meetings started to raise questions in Rachel's mind. Jackson would often come home late, explaining that he had been out with Kevin, but his stories were sometimes vague and inconsistent. One evening, after Jackson returned home later than usual, Rachel decided to ask him more about his evening. Jackson, slightly on edge, mentioned that he and Kevin had gone out for drinks after work and lost track of time. While his explanation seemed plausible, Rachel couldn't ignore the subtle signs of discomfort in Jackson's demeanor. He seemed nervous, and Rachel noticed that he avoided making eye contact when she pressed for details. Rachel observed that he was frequently on his phone, quickly putting it away whenever she entered the room. Despite these signs, Rachel tried to push her doubts aside, not wanting to believe that anything serious could be wrong in their marriage. Around this time, Jennifer confided in Rachel that Kevin had also been acting differently. He had become more secretive, often claiming to be working late or meeting clients after hours. Jennifer expressed concern that something was off, but like Rachel, she didn't want to jump to conclusions. The similarities in their husbands' behavior struck Rachel as odd, but she dismissed it as a coincidence. Both men were busy with their careers, and the pressures of work were likely affecting them. Jackson's absences were now a regular occurrence, and Rachel's feelings of unease deepened. She began to notice small inconsistencies in his stories, details that didn't quite add up. When Rachel tried to ask for more information, Jackson would often change the subject or give vague answers. His defensiveness only fueled Rachel's suspicions, but she couldn't bring herself to confront him directly. Instead, she sought solace in her community work, hoping that her fears would eventually be proven unfounded. As Jackson grew more distant, Rachel couldn't help but feel that their marriage was slipping away. The life they had built together, once so full of love and partnership, now felt fragile and uncertain. Rachel continued to hope that whatever was troubling Jackson would pass, and they could find their way back to each other. Jackson, already struggling with the demands of his career and the strain it was placing on his marriage, found himself increasingly drawn to Kevin. Their connection was undeniable, a mix of emotional intimacy and physical attraction that Jackson had never experienced before. Despite his deepening feelings for Kevin, Jackson was acutely aware of the potential consequences. He knew that if their affair were discovered, it could destroy his marriage, his reputation, and the life he had built with Rachel. Kevin, too, was caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He cared deeply for Jennifer, his wife, and had always considered himself committed to their marriage. But his relationship with Jackson had awakened something within him that he couldn't ignore. The secrecy of their meetings, the risk of being caught, only fueled the intensity of their affair. Jackson often used his business trips as cover, while Kevin invented excuses to be away from home. These clandestine encounters, while thrilling, also began to weigh heavily on both men. The constant need for secrecy, the fear of being caught, and the guilt they felt for betraying their wives started to take a toll on their relationship. The initial excitement of their affair was gradually overshadowed by the growing fear of exposure. Both Jackson and Kevin knew that their actions were dangerous, but neither could bring themselves to end the relationship. They found solace in each other, even as the reality of their situation became increasingly difficult to ignore. Jackson became more paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, fearing that someone might discover their secret. He grew more distant from Rachel, his guilt manifesting as irritation and impatience. He was no longer able to maintain the same level of composure at home, and Rachel, already suspicious, began to notice these changes. Kevin, too, was struggling with the weight of their deception. His relationship with Jennifer, once strong and stable, started to show signs of strain. He found it increasingly difficult to lie to her, and his guilt often surfaced in the form of anxiety and stress. Kevin knew that Jennifer was beginning to sense that something was wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth. The love he felt for Jackson was real, but it came with a cost that he was finding harder to bear with each passing day. Jackson, in particular, found himself increasingly conflicted. He loved Kevin, but he also loved Rachel, or at least the life they had built together. The guilt he felt for betraying her was overwhelming, yet he couldn't bring himself to end the affair. Every time he resolved to break it off with Kevin, he found himself drawn back in, unable to resist the pull of their connection. The duality of his life was becoming too much to bear, and Jackson began to fear that something had to give. Kevin, too, was feeling the pressure. He was torn between his love for Jackson and his loyalty to Jennifer. He knew that their affair couldn't continue indefinitely, but the thought of losing Jackson was unbearable. Kevin started to worry about what would happen if their secret were revealed. He imagined the devastation it would cause Jennifer and the potential collapse of his marriage. The anxiety began to consume him, affecting his work, his relationship with Jennifer, and even his health. Rachel Miller had always prided herself on being attentive to the details of her life. She had a keen sense for when something was off, whether it was a minor issue at one of her charity events or a subtle change in Jackson's behavior. For months, she had tried to ignore the signs: his late nights, the unexplained absences, the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from him whenever she asked about his day. Jackson's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He was more secretive than ever, often glued to his phone and quickly shutting it off whenever Rachel was near. He had become distant, both emotionally and physically, leaving Rachel feeling isolated and alone in their marriage. The man she had once trusted implicitly now seemed like a stranger, and Rachel knew she couldn't ignore the feeling in her gut any longer. One evening, when Jackson was in the shower, Rachel's curiosity got the better of her. She reached for his phone, her hands trembling as she unlocked it. What she found confirmed her worst fears. There, in his messages, were texts from Kevin, messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. They were explicit, filled with references to their meetings and expressions of affection that cut Rachel to the core. But it wasn't just the messages. Jackson's phone also contained photos, selfies of the two men together, some taken in places Rachel recognized as their favorite spots, places where she and Jackson had once shared happy memories. The realization that her husband had taken another man to these places, had replaced her with Kevin, was almost too much to bear. The confrontation came one evening after Jackson returned from yet another late night out. Rachel was waiting for him in the living room, the evidence she had gathered laid out on the coffee table, printed copies of the messages and photos she had found on his phone. Jackson froze when he saw them, his face draining of color as he realized what was happening. "Jackson." Rachel's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Jackson had never heard before. "We need to talk." Jackson sat down slowly, his eyes darting between the evidence on the table and Rachel's face. "Rachel, I can explain." "Explain what?" Rachel interrupted, her voice rising. "Explain how you've been lying to me for months? How you've been sneaking around with Kevin behind my back? How you've destroyed our marriage?" She shook her head, her voice breaking. I trusted you, Jackson. I believed in us. How could you do this? Jackson's initial instinct was to deny, to deflect, but the evidence was irrefutable. He knew there was no point in lying. Instead, he tried to justify his actions, to explain that his relationship with Kevin was something he couldn't control, that it had just happened, and that it didn't mean he didn't love Rachel. But Rachel wasn't interested in excuses. Don't, she said, her voice cold. Don't insult me by pretending this was something you couldn't control. You made a choice, Jackson. You chose to betray me, to betray our marriage. And for what? For him? Jackson had no answer. He sat in silence, unable to meet Rachel's gaze. The weight of his actions, now fully exposed, pressed down on him like a physical burden. He had never intended for things to get this far, never imagined that Rachel would find out in such a brutal way. Rachel, her anger giving way to a steely resolve, stood up and faced Jackson. This ends now, Jackson. You will end whatever it is you have with Kevin. Or I will. I will tell Jennifer, and I will tell everyone in this town what you've been doing. You won't just lose me, you'll lose everything. Jackson's mind raced. He knew Rachel was serious, that she wasn't making an idle threat. If she exposed the affair, it would ruin him. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked so hard to build would be destroyed. The scandal would be catastrophic, not just for him but for Kevin as well. And the fallout for Jennifer. He couldn't even begin to imagine what it would do to her. But even as Rachel laid down her ultimatum, Jackson felt a flicker of defiance. He wasn't ready to let go of Kevin, to give up the relationship that had become so important to him. Yet, he knew he had no choice. Rachel had backed him into a corner, and there was no way out without causing irreparable damage to everyone involved. Rachel, please, Jackson began, but Rachel cut him off. I'm done listening to your excuses, Jackson. I want you to think very carefully about what you're going to do next. Because if you don't end this now, I will make sure everyone knows the truth. And I won't protect you. With that, Rachel turned and left the room, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts. Rachel, having given Jackson the ultimatum, was not idle. She was relentless in her resolve, making it clear that she would not hesitate to follow through on her threat. Her anger and sense of betrayal fueled her determination to ensure that Jackson and Kevin would not escape the consequences of their actions. She began gathering more evidence, preparing to expose the affair in a way that would leave no doubt about what had transpired. Rachel was methodical, coldly calculating in her approach, knowing that once she set her plan in motion, there would be no turning back. Jackson, on the other hand, was spiraling into a state of panic. He had always prided himself on being in control, on managing his life and career with precision. But now, that control was slipping through his fingers. The fear of scandal, the potential destruction of his reputation, and the thought of losing everything he had worked so hard to achieve consumed him. Jackson knew that if Rachel went public with the affair, the fallout would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for Kevin as well. Kevin, too, was terrified. His marriage to Jennifer had already been strained by the affair, and the thought of losing her, and their children, was unbearable. He couldn't imagine how Jennifer would react if she found out the truth, but he knew it would devastate her. Kevin's fear was compounded by the potential consequences for his career. In a small town like Woodlake, where everyone knew everyone, a scandal of this magnitude would be impossible to escape. Rachel's relentless pursuit of the truth only intensified their anxiety. She had begun dropping hints to close friends, making veiled references to Jackson's behavior and the possibility of infidelity. The gossip in Woodlake started to grow, with whispers circulating about trouble in the Miller household. In their growing desperation, Jackson and Kevin began to discuss the unthinkable. The idea started as a fleeting thought, a dark corner of their minds where they dared not linger. But as the days passed and the pressure continued to mount, that thought began to take root. They both knew that if Rachel went to the police or exposed them publicly, their lives would be ruined. The fear of losing everything, of being shamed and ostracized, became too much to bear. Jackson, in particular, was consumed by the need to protect what was left of his life. He had always been a man who could solve problems, who could find a way out of any situation. But now, he felt trapped. like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, with no choice but to jump or be pushed. The idea of taking radical action to silence Rachel began to seem like the only way out. Kevin was horrified by the direction their conversations were taking, but he, too, was terrified of the consequences if Rachel followed through on her threat. The more they talked, the more the idea began to seem like a twisted form of logic. If they could remove the threat, they could save themselves. Kevin's internal conflict was intense. He knew what they were considering was monstrous, but the fear of losing everything was overpowering. The two men began to plan, their discussions becoming more focused, more detailed. They talked about how they could make it look like an accident, something that would raise no suspicions. They debated the risks, the potential for getting caught, and what they would do if things went wrong. The more they planned, the more they became entangled in their own fear and paranoia. They justified their actions by telling themselves that they were doing it to protect their loved ones, that they had no other choice. The tension between the two men reached a boiling point. They argued frequently, each blaming the other for the situation they were in. Jackson accused Kevin of being too weak, of not being willing to do what needed to be done. Kevin, in turn, accused Jackson of being reckless, of pushing them toward a decision that could destroy them both. Jackson was barely sleeping, his mind racing with the details of their plan and the potential consequences. He had begun to drink heavily, using alcohol to numb the fear and guilt that plagued him. Kevin was equally on edge, his nerves frayed to the point where he could hardly focus on anything else. Both men knew that once they set their plan in motion, there would be no turning back. Rachel, unaware of the full extent of what was being plotted against her, continued to push forward with her own plans. She had contacted a lawyer, started drafting a statement, and was preparing to expose the affair in a way that would leave no room for doubt. Jackson and Kevin grew increasingly paranoid. They knew time was running out. Rachel's determination to see justice done had turned their fear into a consuming force, pushing them toward a decision they had once considered unthinkable. The idea of killing Rachel, once a distant, horrifying thought, had now solidified into a plan that Jackson, in particular, felt compelled to execute. Jackson had always been a man who prided himself on his ability to control his environment, to manage every aspect of his life with precision. But now, that control was slipping, and with it, his sense of identity. The prospect of losing everything he had worked for, his career, his social standing, his family, was unbearable. The fear of public humiliation, of being exposed as a fraud and a liar, gnawed at him constantly. In his mind, there was only one way to stop Rachel from ruining him, and that was to silence her permanently. Kevin was less certain. The thought of killing Rachel terrified him, but his fear of losing everything was equally strong. He had become increasingly withdrawn, plagued by guilt and anxiety. The relationship that had once brought him so much excitement and fulfillment now felt like a death sentence. He knew that if they went through with this plan, there would be no turning back, no redemption. But the fear of exposure was too great, and Kevin found himself swept along by Jackson's determination. The night of the murder, Rachel was more determined than ever. She had finished compiling the evidence and was ready to take it to the police the next morning. The confrontation that Jackson had been dreading came sooner than expected. Rachel, furious and resolute, demanded to know why Jackson was still seeing Kevin despite her warnings. She had given him a chance to end the affair, to salvage what was left of their marriage, but he had squandered it. Now she was prepared to follow through on her threat. Jackson, already on edge, snapped. The argument quickly escalated, with Rachel accusing him of betrayal, of destroying their marriage, and of making a mockery of the life they had built together. Her words cut deep, each one a reminder of the consequences he was so desperate to avoid. The fear and rage that had been simmering within Jackson finally boiled over. In a moment of blind fury, he lunged at Rachel, his hands closing around her throat. The struggle was brief but violent. Rachel fought back, her survival instincts kicking in, but Jackson was stronger, fueled by desperation and adrenaline. As Rachel's resistance weakened, Jackson tightened his grip, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: fear, anger, guilt. When Rachel finally went limp, Jackson released her, staggering back in horror at what he had done. The realization hit him like a freight train. Rachel was dead, her body crumpled on the floor, eyes staring lifelessly at the ceiling. Jackson's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to process the enormity of his actions. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had committed an act that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But there was no time for regret. He had to act quickly if he was going to cover his tracks. Jackson moved mechanically, his mind racing as he worked to stage the scene. He arranged the room to make it look like Rachel had tripped and fallen during the struggle, hitting her head on the edge of a coffee table. He wiped down surfaces, careful to remove any trace of the struggle that had just taken place. He rehearsed his story in his mind, preparing to call the police and report the accident. Kevin arrived shortly after, his face pale and drawn. The reality of what they had planned, what Jackson had done, was now staring them both in the face. Kevin's hands shook as he helped Jackson clean up, their fear and guilt palpable in the tense silence. The two men worked quickly, driven by the need to cover their tracks, to ensure that no one would suspect the truth. But despite their careful planning, not everything went as smoothly as they had hoped. There were small details that Jackson and Kevin hadn't accounted for, things that would later raise questions during the investigation. Rachel's phone, for instance, was found in a different room, suggesting that she had been trying to make a call before the accident occurred. There were inconsistencies in Jackson's story, discrepancies that the police would soon notice. And then there was the fact that Rachel's body bore signs of a struggle, marks on her neck that couldn't easily be explained away as a result of a simple fall. When the police arrived, Jackson played his part convincingly, feigning shock and grief as he recounted the events leading up to Rachel's death. Kevin, too, provided a solid alibi, backing up Jackson's version of events. But the officers who responded to the scene were experienced, and something about the situation didn't sit right with them. They noted the inconsistencies, the details that didn't quite add up. As the police began their work, Jackson and Kevin tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. But the weight of their actions hung over them like a dark cloud. The fear of being discovered, of facing the consequences of their crime, was ever present. They had done what they thought was necessary to protect themselves, but the reality of what they had done was inescapable. The investigation into Rachel Miller's death began as a routine inquiry into a tragic accident. The initial police report noted that Rachel had likely fallen during an argument, striking her head fatally on a coffee table. Jackson's account of the incident, supported by Kevin's alibi, seemed plausible enough. However, from the outset, there were details that didn't sit right with the detectives assigned to the case. As the police delved deeper into the circumstances surrounding Rachel's death, they began to uncover inconsistencies. The marks on Rachel's neck didn't align with the narrative of a simple fall. The positioning of her body, the absence of certain defensive wounds, and the placement of objects in the room all raised red flags. Moreover, Rachel's phone, which was found in another room, indicated that she might have been trying to call for help. These details, while subtle, suggested that Rachel's death might not have been an accident after all. The investigation intensified as the police started to piece together a timeline of events. They conducted interviews with friends, neighbors, and colleagues, gradually building a picture of Jackson and Rachel's relationship. It wasn't long before the affair between Jackson and Kevin came to light, further complicating the case. The discovery of their relationship provided a possible motive, and suddenly, the idea that Rachel's death had been a calculated murder seemed increasingly likely. Jennifer, Rachel's best friend, was devastated by the news of her friend's death. From the beginning, she had sensed that something was off. The Jackson she had known for years wouldn't have let something like this happen without reason. As details of the affair surfaced, Jennifer's grief turned to suspicion. Jennifer began her own investigation, starting with Rachel's belongings. She sifted through Rachel's phone, emails, and social media, looking for anything that might provide answers. It wasn't long before she found the messages between Rachel and Jackson, messages that indicated Rachel had discovered the affair and was planning to go to the police. Jennifer also found inconsistencies in the timeline that Jackson had provided to the authorities. Jennifer took her findings to the police, who were already beginning to suspect foul play. Her evidence provided the missing pieces of the puzzle, connecting the dots between Rachel's death and the affair. The police now had enough to obtain search warrants for Jackson's home and Kevin's workplace. During these searches, they uncovered more damning evidence: Jackson's internet search history, which included inquiries about how to stage an accident, and a series of deleted texts between Jackson and Kevin discussing Rachel in increasingly desperate terms. The arrest of Jackson came swiftly. He was charged with first-degree murder, a charge that carried the possibility of life in prison without parole. Kevin, realizing the gravity of the situation, made a deal with the prosecution to testify against Jackson in exchange for a reduced sentence. At trial, the prosecution presented a compelling case. The evidence was overwhelming. Rachel's phone records, the inconsistencies in Jackson's story, the messages between him and Kevin, and Jennifer's testimony all painted a picture of a man who had been willing to kill to protect his secrets. Jackson's defense team attempted to argue that the murder was a crime of passion, committed in the heat of the moment and not premeditated. They claimed that Jackson had acted out of fear and desperation, driven by the imminent threat of losing everything he held dear. But the jury was not swayed. The forensic evidence, combined with Kevin's testimony, proved too strong. Kevin, in his statement, revealed the full extent of their plan, including the decision to stage Rachel's death as an accident. He described the fear and paranoia that had gripped them both, but also how Jackson had ultimately been the one to take Rachel's life. His testimony was the final nail in Jackson's coffin. In the end, the jury found Jackson guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, taking into account the premeditated nature of the crime and the brutality of the act, sentenced Jackson to 30 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. It was a harsh sentence, reflecting the severity of his actions and the devastating impact they had on those around him. Kevin, though spared a prison sentence, did not escape unscathed. His plea deal allowed him to avoid jail time, but it came at a tremendous cost. His marriage to Jennifer, already strained by the affair, crumbled under the weight of the revelations. He lost his job, his standing in the community, and the respect of those who had once considered him a friend. Kevin was left a broken man, his life in ruins, haunted by the choices he had made. Jennifer, for her part, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The betrayal by her husband and the loss of her best friend were wounds that would take years to heal. She found some solace in the knowledge that justice had been served, but it was a hollow victory.